So just across the roundabout from my hotel is a little piece of 1990s history, and history into what would come to be known, sadly, as the Terror Wars. So here is the Thuraya Corporation, and Thuraya was or is rather, a satellite telephone corporation that was one of the 3 satellite phone operators in the 1990s where you could basically make calls all over the world. Think about it as like a global cell phone, if you will. And Thuraya is based here in the UAE. It is actually an Abu Dhabi company that is, I believe, essentially wholly owned today by MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the ruler of Abu Dhabi and essentially the leader of the UAE. And here's an interesting sort of very specific Terror Wars tidbit. So the Guardian's Jason Burke, who was their chief reporter in Afghanistan and Iraq in that era, and he wrote a really good book called The 9/11 Wars. He had an article in October 2002 about US intelligence intercepting a call between Mullah Muhammad Omar, the then leader of the Taliban, the founder of the Taliban, essentially, along with his Pakistani backers, and one of his aides. And apparently in the phone call, as Mullah Omar was talking to his aide, he referenced bin Laden, and that bin Laden was saying hello to the aide. And according to the article, bin Laden's voice could be heard in the background, and after US intelligence analyzed it, they determined that it was definitely bin Laden's voice print. And the article alludes to that eavesdropping was in September of 2002, basically just a year after the 9/11 attacks, when the fate of bin Laden was really uncertain and his whereabouts were unknown. There were rumors that he was possibly dead. Those rumors persisted until he was actually assassinated in Abbottabad, Pakistan in May 2011. And there are also some references that bin Laden may have been using a Thuraya phone, but I think it was more likely that he was using an Inmarsat phone, which was a British competitor to Thuraya. And interestingly, the bin Laden family, under their corporation, the Saudi bin Laden Group, were actually involved in the Iridium satellite network. So there were basically 3 of these networks that were going on at the time. And just a little bit of personal history with why I will always remember this company is that at the very beginning of my reporting career, which was in Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, after I had witnessed 9/11 in New York, I just went there with an analog camera, which at the time, as I referenced earlier in one of my Iraq videos, were just called cameras. They weren't called analog cameras. It's kind of like phones weren't called landlines for a while, and until after cell phones became the norm. It's kind of one of those things where a technology that is preeminent gets sort of retroactively renamed. But all of the big money journalists had Inmarsat and Thuraya phones to transmit their stories from Afghanistan. And I remember talking to somebody in Hojabaudin, which was where all the journalists were based in Takhar province in northern Afghanistan at the time, and I was like, where did you get this phone? And they were like, oh, I got it in Dubai on the way here. And the Thuraya technology at the time, I have no idea about now, but it was incredibly expensive, and I think it worked on like prepaid credit or something, where you had to buy these like rechargeable cards to be able to keep using it. And what's so fascinating about this company is that both terrorist organizations and news organizations were using the same technology to get their message out to the world. So terrorists were using Thuraya technology to communicate with each other, to carry out attacks and to spread their ideology. And then journalists were using this technology to report their stories about the after effects of the terrorist ideology. So to me, this is really interesting. It's like part of why I love this hotel here in Barsha Heights, Dubai, is because this building just the branding of this building just reminds me of that era. And just one last bit, when I went to Iraq in 2003, which I reminisce about in some of my Baghdad episodes, more journalists had sat phones then, and I still couldn't afford one. So kind of like the digital camera, I had, in my early journalism career, I had choices where I could either get to the story, get to the heart of the onset of the terror wars, but lacking the technology to adequately compete and report on these events in real time. I had to be satisfied with just recording things on actual audio cassettes and shooting things on cameras, ordinary, cameras, and writing things down on notepads. And thus I never got a Thuraya phone. And of course, part of the importance of this company was that there was no cell service. There was not mobile technology in Afghanistan or Iraq or many other places in the world at that time. So just wanted to give you a little bit of Dubai / UAE history, and it's kind of an interesting way in that this little piece of geography and this building, which probably dates back to probably the 80s, I would say, judging by the architecture, just taking a stab, relates to the history of our times, the terror wars, which have dominated headlines for the better part of 20 years until basically the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. I want to add on one last more bit, which was that on the importance of satellite phones, their signals, and strategic vulnerabilities. So in April of 1996, the rebel leader of Chechnya, who was called Dzhokhar Dudayev, was killed by the Russian military by an air-to-ground missile through tracking the signal on his satellite phone in the Chechen Republic. And that was kind of what put satellite phones on the global map, was the assassination of Dudayev. So I think there were hopes that, in the 2000s, even in the late 90s, there were ideas that, if we could track bin Laden's exact location, if we could catch him on a phone call, we could send a cruise missile to wipe him and all of his people out, and, the surrounding property. And of course that never happened. And there was a lot of controversy, or controversy if you prefer, there was this supposed leak about bin Laden making satellite calls, and a news outlet, spoiling ideas to track bin Laden in 1998, and so on and so forth. But of course, it was already well established that bin Laden used satellite technology. He himself said so. So it was a little bit of a kind of, I guess, what's morphed into an urban legend about that there was a lost opportunity in the Clinton era to assassinate bin Laden if a selfish news media hadn't sort of narcissistically leaked this story. And this actually persisted all the way into the Trump era, that this idea kept being repeated, that this opportunity was lost in the 90s to get bin Laden. And there's a few of those kind of things which have kind of become canards in this day and age. Now, why digging up the story of the Thuraya satellite phone thing is really interesting, and the satellite phone era of the 1990s in general, is that there was a narrative about Osama bin Laden and his acolytes that they wanted to return the world to the 7th century, to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And the truth is that bin Laden was actually an early adapter to technology before almost anybody in the West. I mean, a satellite phone being used in Afghanistan in the 90s, just think how advanced that is, actually. Just look back on that. That's more than 25 years ago that he was using this technology. And so was the rebel leader of Chechnya that I mentioned, who was assassinated. So this idea that there were these men who ran these kind of ideologically or ethnically revanchist movements were really backward looking because maybe of their attitudes about women or their attitudes about, you know, territory or nationalism or whatever the specificity was of their cause, that they somehow eschewed technology. And this is where the divide between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda really kind of splits. Because although there were members of the Taliban who were, of course, very anti-technology, they were against the idea of the graven image, they were against the idea of music, I can assure you that the upper echelon of both of these movements definitely exploited technology. They used the technology that was available at the time, whether it was satellite phones, you know, video cassettes, video cameras, audio recording. They had to find ways to disseminate their message, and by ways, I mean forms of technology. And they often did these things ahead of, you know, they were out ahead of intelligence agencies, you know, in the US, the EU, and so on. So there's a real kind of, to this day, there's kind of a misunderstanding about that. I mean, I think at best you could say that there was a stark dichotomy between Sunni Salafi jihadi terrorist leaders' stated aims and their actual methods as to how they practiced terror. So they certainly did not eschew things like televisions and audio cassettes and satellite phones. They may have espoused to their followers to eschew these things, but the leaders certainly didn't themselves. Now, as I've explained the interesting bit of history with the connection between this 1990s satellite telephone company and the likes of Osama bin Laden and Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar, you might be asking yourself, okay, that's an interesting bit of history that kind of tethers Dubai to the terror wars, and here in the Barsha Heights neighborhood specifically. But what does that have to do with today? Well, I just want to give you a couple of interesting little tie-ins that I wanted to add to the commentary that I've already laid down. One is that Thuraya is a subsidiary of a satellite company that is a subsidiary of Mubadala Investments, which is an Abu Dhabi state-owned investment firm. And a couple of the things that they're into is they are a major investor in the NSO Group, which is the Israeli spyware company that owns and innovated Pegasus, which you may have read about in the papers or heard about on the news. That's the spyware that tracks journalists, that eavesdrops on journalists' mobile phones, and also tracks prominent human rights activists in the UAE and around the world, wherever clients desire. Now, it also ties into what I'm doing on YouTube, because Mubadala is an investor in Google's self-driving car program under Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google. And you see, it all ties together. So you take this phone company, which is kind of a relict of a prior technology before cell phone technology was, was kind of evened out around the world. I mean, now, this still might be useful in, say, Antarctica or the deepest reaches of the Sahara Desert, or maybe the Sahel in Africa. So I'm sure Thuraya still has some uses, but I remember when it was absolutely essential. But it tethers together everything from spyware that's snooping on your phone if you're like a global intellectual and you're reporting on things or campaigning for issues that are important to human freedom. And it's also a couple of degrees of separation away from YouTube, because YouTube is owned by Google, which is under Alphabet, and Alphabet has the Google self-driving car program, of which the parent company of Thuraya is an investor. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. It's just an interesting facet of globalization about how basically everything is connected. It's kind of like that movie Syriana with George Clooney and Matt Damon. It's, everything is somehow connected.